Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we can begin this session. Now, the subject of this panel, as you can see, is great power involvement in the Arab upheavals. And one might legitimately ask, I think, why we're bothering with this topic. Because the conventional wisdom is, the received wisdom, particularly in politically correct circles, is that outsiders should not really be involved in domestic upheavals. And whether they are or not, ultimately it is the people themselves who will decide their fates. Unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, empirically that doesn't seem to be entirely true. In fact, I think a defensible argument can be made that it is precisely the involvement of outside powers, the type of involvement, the intensity of the involvement of outside powers, which has had and will continue to have an important, even decisive effect on the course of these developments in various Arab countries. I think that is almost indisputably true in the case of Libya, almost indisputably true thus far in the case of Bahrain, where the outside involvement was not of extra-regional powers as much as of regional powers, but nevertheless external to the society involved. To a lesser extent, perhaps in Egypt, and I think almost certainly so with respect to Syria. And therefore, this is, I think, indisputably vital question to look at how and why outside powers are involved in these various upheavals in Arab countries. Now, we can't cover the entire world, of course, but we are three of us here who will try and take a look at the way in which great outside powers, China, Russia, and the United States to some extent, have been, are, and perhaps will be involved or not in the course of domestic developments in the wake of the upheavals that began at the end of 2010 in Tunisia. So to look at these issues, we have three primary contributors. The first is Professor Graeme Auton of the University of the Redlands, who has been professor of government at the University of Redlands since 1987, and is also an adjunct professor in the Graduate National Security Studies program at California State University. I'm not going to give the entire bio note, which has been sent, because you can read it in the program if you will. But he is going to say something about the nature of the involvement of Russia in these developments. And next we have Professor Donovan Chau from California State University, who's Associate Professor of Political Science at California State University, San Bernardino. And he has studied at Claremont McKenna College at Missouri State University and the University of Reading. And finally, myself, Mark Heller from the Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University. And after Professor Chau makes his comments, I will provide a few introductory remarks about the United States, and then we will proceed into our discussion. So let us begin. Let us try, in order to keep this, as I say, as roundtable-ish as possible, to try to address similar questions in the case of all three powers. First of all, how have they and how do they understand the character of the events that are unfolding in the Arab world? Secondly, what are the objectives that are driving their involvement or non-involvement in these developments, and the methods by which they've gone about pursuing those objectives. And lastly, a couple of words, if you will, on what that may augur for their future involvement in this part of the world. So perhaps we'll begin with you, Professor Auton, if you will.
I'll keep it short in the interest of having some discussion. And I took a bit of a liberty with the subject because probably I'm going to focus perhaps a bit more on geopolitics than the panel topic would suggest. Let me just begin this way in talking about Russia. On November 13th and 14th, just a few days ago, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu met with their Egyptian counterparts in Cairo to discuss Russian-Egyptian security cooperation in the wake of the Obama administration's ostensible shutoff of military assistance to the Mansouri al-Sisi regime in Cairo. 4 days later, on November 18th, Russia signed an agreement to provide air defense systems to Egypt, not exactly what the Egyptian government needs in order to resolve its current problems. And on the 20th, just 2 days ago, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu flew to Moscow to discuss the impending nuclear deal between Iran and the P5+1. Putin's job, I suspect, was to try and persuade Netanyahu to go along with that deal. So what are we to make of this? Where do Russian interests in the Middle East lie in the wake of Moscow's evident success in the August-September Syrian crisis? How does Moscow, through its actions, dispose itself toward what's left of the Arab Spring? The bottom line is that despite Moscow's evident success in rescuing Assad, and I might add the Obama administration from U.S. military strikes, changes in the Middle East are undermining the position of Russia in the region. The United States and Iran could be, I stress could be, headed toward a compromise, even a rapprochement, that would alter the realities of the region. If a deal between Washington and Tehran takes place, Russia would lose one of its last sources of leverage in the Middle East. Russia's ally, Bashar Assad, may have been rescued for now, but clearly he's hanging on by his fingertips and is unlikely to control all of Syria anytime soon. In some ways, his survival has as much to do with a decision in the Obama administration, I would argue, to support neither side in the Syrian civil war, as it is any decision made in Moscow. And that in and of itself perhaps indicates a changing U.S. attitude toward the Arab Spring. As George Friedman at Stratfor has put it, during the Soviet era and under Putin, I'm quoting him now, the Russian strategy toward the United States has been to generate problems in diverse areas in order to force U.S. actions that diffuse American power and lead Washington to overcommit. From this perspective, Washington's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have promoted Moscow's interests, preventing a more assertive U.S. strategy in the near abroad, creating a window of opportunity for the Russians to recover their balance. Russia's support over the years of an Iranian sphere of influence has compelled the U.S. to remain engaged in the Middle East to protect Israel and Saudi Arabia and the other GCC states. At the same time, Russia's relationship with Iran has helped Moscow in its fight against Sunni separatism in the North Caucasus. Russia's relationship with Iran finally has broadened the scope for Russian energy development, including crude oil swaps in the Caspian Basin. Russia's foreign policy interests are ultimately to, first of all, balance against what it perceives to be U.S. hegemonism, second, to promote its commercial interests, and third, to secure its own territorial integrity. Putin has advanced those interests in the Middle East in the face of the Arab Spring from what is largely a weak power base. Russia is a regional power that cannot match the U.S. militarily, though I would argue Putin and Lavrov have played a weak poker hand masterfully, using not a little bluff. A U.S. strike against Syria earlier this fall would have underscored Russia's weakness in many of the same ways that NATO airstrikes against Serbia in 1999 did. Moscow had to do what it could to avoid that outcome. In the meantime, Moscow, I think, will have to contemplate what it can do in its relationship with Arab states and with Israel to cope with the possibility of a changing balance of power in the region. To get back to the Russian-Egyptian relationship, Russia can undoubtedly be useful to Egypt with respect to military cooperation and perhaps financial support. But in the long run, that relationship is going to be a poor substitute for Egypt's well-developed relationship with the United States. I would argue to conclude that Russia, through its actions, has not exactly shown a support for many of the consequences of the Arab Spring, although its policies in the region certainly are changing.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Professor Chau.
I'm going to step over there and make the roundtable a little more rectangular.
Rectangular?
Rectangular.
Okay.
Just have a few slides. I won't bore you too much here, I hope, with some eye candy. But I thought it'd be useful just to add some imagery to what I'm talking about. And I think with what Dr. Heller has asked us to do, I've essentially was able to read his mind, and I was able to answer this in terms of the Chinese strategic view of the region, their understanding of what they don't call it the Middle East. I'll tell you what they call it in just a moment. Some of their objectives, their methods, and perhaps their long-term future role. A little bit about, first of all, just to put this into the context of Chinese foreign policy. The Chinese, and sorry, this is how I operationalize my question here, to focus principally on late December to October of 2011 and focusing on Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, the Chinese involvement. And so the Chinese involvement from their foreign policy perspective, they are interested in creating, quote, a favorable international environment, and principally because Chinese strategic priorities are domestic. Chinese economic development and what they call social stability, this trumps pretty much anything else that the Chinese are interested anywhere in the world, whether it's in the region of the world that we're talking about today, whether it's in Africa, which I've studied more long term, whether it's in Latin America, anywhere else. What China values the most is what they call social stability, and I want us all to keep that in mind. And from a strategic perspective, because China is where it is, they view what we call the Middle East as West Asia and North Africa. In fact, that's the name of their bureau within their foreign ministry, or department, sorry, West Asia and North African affairs. And I think this is really important for us to understand, and when I talk about Egypt, you'll understand it a little bit more, because Egypt really is the linchpin for China's interactions in West Asia, what they call West Asia and North Africa. Indeed, the Chinese really have been involved in a lot of different ways historically, and I just briefly want to touch on this before I jump into the period of time that we're focusing on. But there's been long-standing historical interactions between the Chinese people and the people that live in this region of the world, North Africa, West Asia, if we're going to use a Chinese lexicon. And those long-standing relationships, we can refer to some of these, and many of you, if not all, are aware of the phrase, the Silk Road. And so some have reinvigorated that phrase to say that the Chinese are creating a modern Silk Road or a new Silk Road. And so I'm not quite sure if that's actually happening, but that just the perception is that this is happening. And I think this is important to keep in mind. There are interactions, long-standing interactions going back thousands of years, Chinese cultural, commercial interactions with West Asia and North Africa, and vice versa, and so that's very important to keep in mind. With specific reference to the more modern period, these are the main areas of Chinese objectives and essentially their tools, selling arms, and for the reason being principally to have influence, long-term strategic influence, which is basically my argument for Chinese interaction in the region. And you'll note the couple countries that stand out in West Asia, North Africa on these two charts, if you can see them. The oil importation, principally Saudi Arabia and Iran, are major oil exporters to China, and perhaps not coincidentally, Saudi Arabia and Iran also show up on the list of top export markets for Chinese military companies. And that's interesting. I'll turn your attention to just the trade volume graphic and notice that there was no downtick, if you will, during the Arab upheavals. There was no downtick, and that's something to consider. That's something to consider. But let me just focus first on Tunisia and just run through these very quickly. Tunisia, the Chinese, they import things like olive oil. They have engaged in joint ventures, for example, fertilizer, joint ventures within the United States, Tunisian companies in China. And so there's not a whole lot of interaction, but there is some, and Tunisia is one of the growing economic partners of China in North Africa. And so the Chinese, they didn't really do much between December and mid-January of 2011, and it wasn't really until the dust had settled, that is, and you'll notice the date here, January 15th, and that should stand out because the day before is when there was the stepping down of Ben Ali in Tunisia. And so the Chinese, they're interested in what they call friendship and cooperation, and this is what they intend to maintain no matter who's basically running the show in Tunisia as elsewhere. And let me just go ahead and push it forward to Egypt. And you see that the Chinese, they were close, very, very close with Mubarak in Egypt. And in fact, Egypt was the very first country in Africa, as well as in the Arab nation world in 1956 to recognize communist China. And that matters to the Chinese people. It matters very, very much so. 1956, and that's basically where the Chinese were able to develop influence elsewhere in Africa. And I've done some research on that. Happy to talk more about that if you would like to talk about Chinese in Africa. And you notice that those couple images that the Chinese will interact with whoever is running Egypt. And they have done so. And in 2009, in fact, there was a codification of how important the two countries value one another's friendship in terms of a strategic cooperation agreement. And so that's something to think about. And it's really, so the involvement really is diplomatic, it's maintaining ties, it's having people in these countries, and that turns me to Libya. And this is really where we saw the most Chinese involvement, so to speak, in the context of the Arab upheavals during the period of examination. And the reason being is because the Chinese in Libya, they decided to evacuate all of their nationals in the span of less than 10 days. And this was over 36,000 Chinese that were operating infrastructure projects, telecommunications, oil infrastructure, and the like. And this was a sophisticated logistical operation, and principally involving non-military assets, because the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, does not really have the type of naval or airlift capabilities that, for example, the U.S. military has. But nevertheless, the Chinese, and I like to use this analogy, they sort of scattered like rats, and they left Libya in all directions, as you could see from that. This graphic was provided by Xinhua, their New China news agency. And they really, the Chinese government commended itself very much so in terms of this operation. And based on my research, I did not come across any actually Chinese fatalities or casualties. And so that's saying something, although it really is interesting to think more, and maybe we'll have more time during the roundtable to talk about what does this show about Chinese power in the region. I'm not quite sure, but I'll leave that open-ended. And so let me come back to, I didn't really spend a lot of time on my title. My title was Wandering West, and I know this is a roundtable, so not really having titles here. But in terms of the future, you'll notice there is a publication here by a well-known Chinese strategist affiliated with Beijing or Peking University, and this was published toward the tail end of the Libyan civil war, so early October 2012. And there's basically a strategic perspective from Professor Wang here, or Dr. Wang, in terms of what the Chinese should do in the future, and perhaps marching west. And so I don't know if that's not what they did, though, during the Arab upheavals. They were basically doing this. They were spectating. They were watching and waiting to see how things turned out. They were willing to work with both sides in Egypt, in Libya, and we could talk during the roundtable, the discussion about Chinese weapons in Libya, and during there's supposed discussions between Chinese arms manufacturers and Libyan officials Gaddafi officials during the Libyan civil war. But essentially the Chinese are waiting things out, and they have a long-term perspective in terms of their strategy, not just in West Asia, North Africa, but really in many parts of the world. And the focal point of Chinese interests remain in East Asia, closer to its borders. However, they certainly do have interests in maintaining ties, accessing this region of the world, and trying to make some money in the process. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Chau. My two colleagues really got the easy part of the assignment. It's not, I think, all that difficult to understand what is driving both China and Russia in the formulation of their policies in this Middle East, Arab world in general, and in response to the political upheavals taking place in some of those countries. In particular, both of them, for perfectly understandable reasons, aren't particularly enthusiastic about the idea of challenges to authoritarian regimes receiving support from outside powers. They don't like intervention against the status quo. Russia is striving, I think, as Professor Auton said, to play weak hand in a masterful way in order to reassert Russia's rightful place as a great power actor, at least as they see it. A real desire to play in the big leagues. And China, as Professor Chau has graphically shown us, pursuing a foreign policy which is driven by a domestic political economic agenda, and is therefore primarily interested in stability, and doesn't really care that much about the character of the regimes it deals with in other countries in order to promote that. I got the tough angle with part of this, which is trying to figure out what the United States is all about, you know. Because compared to China and Russia, I think the United States could be fairly described as an inscrutable foreign policy machine. And if one word could be used to describe, I think, the answers to the questions I posed to all three of us, it is confused. You know, when former President George Bush was formulating American policy in this part of the world, there was at least something that could be defined as the ostensible objective of the United States. And that was promoting the kinds of regimes or political systems which were more in accord with that administration's view of what is the proper way for societies and governments to be organized. In a word, democratization. Now, they weren't necessarily actively promoting regime change, except in the case of Iraq. But I think they were definitely encouraging reform and transformation of authoritarian regimes in most other parts of the region through a variety of initiatives, some of them unilateral and some of them multilateral, all of them wrapped up in impressive sounding programs like Millennial Challenge Account and Middle East Partnership Initiative and so on and so forth, intended to promote the kinds of changes in governance and policy in other countries, which authoritarian rulers naturally tended to try to resist or at least drag their heels on because they ultimately represented a threat to their own ability to stay in power. And that was something which the administration felt served both American values and American interests. Because one of the diagnoses of the source of the kind of anti-American terrorism, most graphically illustrated by 9/11, was the ostensible American identification with authoritarian regimes in this part of the world. And therefore, the pursuit of those changes was something which the administration felt was both in the American interest and an American value. Now, after the change of administrations in Washington, to me at least, the picture became, one can, by the way, of course, agree or strongly disagree with the way the Bush administration went about doing these things, or even how realistic the objectives were. But at least, as I say, it was possible with some clarity to define what it was about. After the change of administrations in Washington at the beginning of 2009, to my mind at least, the picture became much clearer. I mean, much muddier, less clear. And it was particularly not clear to me how the United States was reacting when some of the changes that the previous administration was advocating seemed to be on the verge of materializing, not so much as the result of foreign power initiatives as the result of active domestic discontent in those countries themselves. Now, the fact that the administration did not really know what to do, how to react, when friendly but authoritarian rulers began to be challenged and then actively overthrown. First in Tunisia, and we saw that nice little cartoon about the domino effect, almost. and certainly by the time it reached Egypt a month or two later and pushed over Mubarak. The fact that the administration was a little bit confused about what to do and how to do it is sometimes explained as an inability to choose between interests and values. There seemed to be a kind of an instinctive preference on the part of the Obama administration to sympathize with the opponents of the regime, the anti-authoritarian popular movements, or what seemed to be anti-authoritarian popular movements. There seemed to be some kind of contradiction or tension between that instinctive tendency and the interests that were served by close American relations with regimes like that of Mubarak in Egypt. And one might go further and say, like the Saudi regime, which is not, I think, more of a Jeffersonian democracy than Mubarak was. Personally, I think it's a false contradiction. Although that doesn't necessarily mean that's not the way it was perceived. I think it's a false contradiction because the antithesis or the opposition to those regimes which were ostensibly serving American interests were not necessarily the embodiment of American values, although that's the way it was originally perceived, not just in this country, but generally in the West. After all, it was Western analysts who invented the term Arab Spring. What kind of spring were they talking about? They were evoking the Spring of Nations of 1848 or the European Spring of 1989. They were evoking Western patterns of democratizing oppositions to authoritarian regimes. And there seems to have been a kind of an unquestioned assumption that if you are opposed to a particular authoritarian regime, that ipso facto makes you a Democrat, which is kind of a little bit formulistic, simplistic kinds of thinking. And I think there was an overestimation of the feasibility of realizing American values by getting rid of authoritarian rulers. In any case, that certainly seems to, as far as I can understand, at least certainly seems to motivate what originally seemed like lukewarm American support for Mubarak, at best, or at worst, active encouragement of the opposition movement that overthrew Mubarak. Well, part of this, I think, is due to the fact that the change of administrations meant that America had gone from President Bush to President un-Bush. But it's not just the administrations, you see. I think, to be fair, I think we have to accept the fact that the approach of this administration is reflective of a very large, perhaps majority segment of American public opinion. Obama did not create this situation. He inherited a country which was tired of wars, tired of excessive involvement in the affairs of other people for what was not always obviously to America's benefit. This is not really so much about the use of force, because after all, this administration has also not been shy to use force. And depending on how one categorizes and different kinds of uses of force, this administration has, apart from the initial invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, has used as much force as the previous administration. And if Obama criticized Bush for a surge in Iraq, he was the one who authorized a surge in Afghanistan. And he was the one who authorized, in fact, the intensification of the use of what are called drone strikes. So it's not about the use of force per se. It's more about the use of force which is reactive and divorced from any kind of obvious strategic purpose. Now, the result is that the regional perception of the United States has changed because of its vacillating support, as I said, for Mubarak, because of its unwillingness to endorse the use of or support the use of Saudi force in Bahrain, particularly because of its vacillating approach in Syria, where the administration could never figure out who the good guys were and who the bad guys are. I mean, not in any absolute sense, obviously, because I don't know if any of us can do that. Maybe there aren't any good guys. But unable to figure out whom it prefers to see prevailing in Syria. And even, I think I would add, although it's not directly opposite to our subject now, its approach to Iran. All of which, I think, has created a growing impression in the Middle East that the United States is not really a great power anymore. I mean, it still has the metrics of a great power, particularly the material manifestations of military power and military reach, and economic leverage as well, notwithstanding the growth of China and notwithstanding the combined economic performances of the European Union. The United States still drives the global economy and still has a dominant, if not exclusive, control of international or global financial institutions. The United States still has the metrics of a great power, but it doesn't have the behavioral characteristics of a great power anymore. One of which is the determination to support your friends and punish, if not intimidate, your adversaries. And therefore, as I say, there is a growing perception that the United States is no longer either feared or respected in the Middle East. Now, there's a long-standing argument. It's gone on for several years now about the theory of declinism and whether the United States is in decline. It doesn't really matter objectively whether or not it's true, I think. What matters is the perception. And there is a perception that that is happening because the United States is not interested in being a great power anymore. Just as Obama said shortly after his inauguration, nation building begins at home. And that is what his part of the American political spectrum strongly believes. Well, one of the consequences of that is that regional actors, whether they are governments which have traditionally been aligned with the United States or non-government, non-state forces, including opposition movements, which place their hope or their faith or their trust in the United States, no longer have as much confidence as they have done in the past that they can rely on the United States. Of course, you know, that raises a kind of a serious dilemma for most of them, which is, what's the alternative? And there are a couple of I would say, hypothetical alternatives, one of which is greater mutual support and cooperation among those friends and allies of the United States, among themselves. Another is the diversification of their portfolio, so to speak, by looking for sources of support elsewhere. I mean, we're treated to ironic kinds of developments in the last couple of months. This has to do with Iran as well, where the Americans are behaving more French and the French are behaving more American. But in point of fact, I mean, I think in reality, there aren't real viable alternatives to the United States. Those are fallback positions, second or third best options. And therefore, to the extent that the American role in any of this is important and absent, the prospect, I think, is for greater confusion in the region itself, greater weakness, greater instability, and in the end, we will have, contrary, I think, to the hope of the administration when it came to power, that it is, came into office at least, that it is even more important to be liked than it is to be feared or respected. In the end, we are likely to end up with the United States, which is neither feared, nor respected, nor liked. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.